Imagine a civilization that has, reached the absolute pinnacle of global power, like a society that spans continents, commands immense wealth, and just boasts unparalleled technological advancement.
Right, the absolute peak of influence.
Exactly. Now, imagine this same civilization creates massive structural problems on a global scale. I mean, problems of staggering human suffering and really complex economic disparity.
It was a pretty heavy premise.
It is. And then it discovers something terrifying about itself, which is that it is completely incapable of solving the very chaos it unleashed.
Yeah, that's the fatal flaw right there.
Right. But rather than face that failure, this civilization chooses to simply, well, close its eyes. It wraps itself in its highest principles, its most sacred religious and philosophical ideals, and it uses them as a smokescreen to cover up a reality of trickery and deceit.
Wow.
So when you look at that civilization, are you looking at a thriving, enlightened society? Or are you looking at a dying one, like a society in the final stages of a terminal illness?
That is a deeply haunting scenario to consider. And, we aren't talking about some science fiction thought experiment here.
No, not at all.
That premise, that specific diagnosis of a fatally diseased society, is the opening salvo of the text that fundamentally altered the intellectual landscape of the 20th century.
And that is exactly the foundation we are exploring on today's deep dive. We are spending our time today unpacking a text that hit the international stage in 1955 like a philosophical earthquake.
Yeah, Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism.
Right. And because we want to see how his ideas evolved and really crystallized, we are also weaving in insights from a very revealing interview Césaire gave 12 years later, I think, in 1967.
Yes, to the Haitian poet René de Bestre.
Exactly. So we are going to look closely at how Césaire completely dismantles the enduring myth of the civilizing mission. We want to show you how he exposed the hidden, devastating psychological and cultural costs of empire, and not just on the people who are conquered, but on the conquerors themselves.
It's a text that really demands your full attention because, Césaire's arguments are active, aggressive challenges to the standard narrative of Western history.
I really are.
He is taking the orthodox history that you likely found in mid-century textbooks and just turning it completely inside out.
Which means I need to pause here and offer a very explicit roadmap for you, the listener. The source material we are covering today contains incredibly charged, fierce political content.
He pulls absolutely no punches.
None. We will be examining his unsparing critiques of capitalism, his indictment of European civilization, his warnings about the United States, and his ultimate call for a global proletariat revolution.
Right. It's intense.
So I want to be perfectly clear here. As your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking a political side. We are not endorsing Césaire's worldview, nor are we condemning it.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. Our mission is to be impartial cartographers. We want to map out the mechanics of his philosophy so you can clearly understand his arguments, the historical context he was reacting to, and the precise logic he used to construct his critique.
And to truly grasp the impact of what Césaire is doing, you really have to temporarily inhabit his historical moment.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Let's wind the clock back to the mid-1950s. The world is still nursing the immense psychic wounds of the Second World War. The atrocities of the Holocaust have been laid bare, the atomic bomb has redefined warfare, and the globe is rapidly freezing into the binary standoff of the Cold War.
Right, a super tense era.
Extremely. But beneath that superpower tension, a massive tectonic shift is happening in the global south.
The era of unquestioned European empires is ending.
Precisely. You have this combustible atmosphere where anti-colonial movements are moving from the margins to the center stage. The French are fighting a losing battle in Indochina. Dien Bien Phu falls in 1954. The Algerian War for Independence is igniting. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, there is a profound intellectual and physical awakening. And standing in the center of this storm is Aimé Césaire.
He's such a fascinating figure. He was a Martinican poet, an incredibly sharp intellectual, and a politician, right?
Yeah. Martinique was, and actually still remains, an overseas department of France located in the Caribbean.
So Césaire occupies a very unique space here. He is a colonized black man, but he is also a product of the most elite tiers of the French educational system.
That is the crucial paradox of his identity. I mean, he has read the entire canon of Western literature and philosophy. He knows the European intellectual tradition as well as, if not better than, his colonizers.
Wow, so he knows their playbook inside and out.
Exactly. When he publishes the Discourse on Colonialism, He is not writing from the outside. He is taking the very language, the rhetoric, and the logic of the French Academy, and he is weaponizing it. He turns their own philosophical tools against them.
Let's look at how he actually deploys that weapon. Because he doesn't start by arguing about, tax rates or import tariffs.
No, he goes way deeper than that.
Right. He goes straight for the foundational morality of the entire colonial enterprise. He argues that the great original lie of Western imperialism boils down to one dishonest equation.
And that equation is the idea that Christianity automatically equals civilization, and that paganism automatically equals savagery.
Exactly. That's the core lie for him.
He identifies that single equation as the source code for centuries of violence. From that premise that Europe represents light and everything else is darkness, every subsequent horror was essentially justified.
And he just strips away the noble vocabulary, the standard justifications that the empire was supposedly expanding to spread the gospel or build hospitals or end local tyrannies.
Pushing back the frontiers of ignorance, as they called it.
Right. He tells his readers to drop the delusion. He argues that colonization was never a philanthropic enterprise. It wasn't an attempt to extend the rule of law. He insists we look at who the actual decisive actors were on the ground.
And who were they?
Well, it wasn't the enlightened scholar or the benevolent priest leading the charge. The vanguard of the empire consisted of the adventurer, the pirate, the wholesale grocer, the ship owner, the gold digger, and the merchant.
The driving forces were just appetite and force. And Césaire makes a brilliant historical observation here.
Oh, what's that?
He points out that the grand moral hypocrisy of the civilizing mission is actually a relatively late invention in the history of conquest.
Wait, really? He's saying the early conquerors didn't even bother pretending to be the good guys?
Exactly. He points to figures like Cortés in Mexico or Pizarro in Peru. When they arrived, they didn't hand out pamphlets claiming they were there on a cultural exchange program,
Right, or a mentorship program to uplift the locals.
Yeah, exactly. They arrived with helmets, lances, and an insatiable greed for gold. They slaughtered, they plundered, and they were entirely transparent about their motives.
So when did all the high-minded rhetoric start?
Césaire argues that these slavering apologists, the intellectuals, the politicians, the historians, who retroactively dressed this massive theft up in the language of humanism, they came much later.
Oh, I see.
The moral hypocrisy was draped over the violence after the fact, mostly just to make it palatable to the polite society of Paris or London.
That makes total sense. And this brings us to a concept that sits at the very heart of his critique. He distills the reality of imperialism into a stark, devastating equation. He writes that colonization equals thing-ification.
Thing-ification, yeah. The original French term he uses is chosification. It's a slightly clunky word when translated into English, but conceptually, it is like a sledgehammer.
Let's really unpack the mechanics of that, because how does a system turn a living, breathing human being into a thing? What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it is the systemic reduction of human complexity down to raw utility. Césaire argues that you simply cannot exploit another human being to the extreme lethal degree required by a colonial extraction economy if you actually acknowledge their shared humanity.
Right, because empathy gets in the way.
Exactly. If you look at a person and see a father, a poet, a historian, someone with a soul and a lineage, your conscience will eventually revolt against working them to death in a mine or a cotton field.
So you have to dehumanize them first.
Yes. The colonial system requires a psychological prerequisite. The colonizer must systematically strip the colonized of their human essence.
You have to empty them out completely.
You empty them out, and you replace their humanity with their function. They cease to be a person and become a unit of labor, an instrument of production.
Wow.
And Césaire paints a grim picture of the daily reality. He says that in this system, there is zero genuine human contact between the colonizer and the colonized.
It's all just transactional, right?
Worse than transactional. All natural human relations are replaced by relations of pure domination and submission.
Yeah, he writes that it becomes an ecosystem composed entirely of forced labor, intimidation, pressure, police violence, taxation, theft, rape, and compulsory crops. The system doesn't just degrade the colonized, it forces them into a completely artificial, violent dynamic.
And to really throw this into sharp relief, Césaire contrasts this colonial reality with the pre-colonial societies that were destroyed to make way for it. He is totally unapologetic in his defense of these older indigenous structures.
Yeah, I noticed that when reading, he describes these pre-colonial societies as communal, democratic, cooperative, and fraternal. He even explicitly labels them as profoundly
Which
anti-capitalist.
was a very provocative term to use.
For sure. He claims there are societies where the concept of failure simply didn't exist in the way we understand it. But wait, I had to ask you, if he's presenting these societies as perfect, harmonious utopias, isn't he just falling into the old European noble savage trope?
Oh, like the idea that indigenous people were pure innocents before the West arrived.
Yeah, exactly that.
It's a very fair question, and it's actually a trap Césaire carefully avoids. He isn't claiming these societies were flawless, magical utopias without disease or conflict or internal problems.
Okay, so what is his point then?
He is arguing that they were viable. They were complete, functional economies and social structures that were adapted to the environment and the people who lived there.
They worked for the people in them.
Right. He writes that they were content to simply be. They didn't have to pretend to be an abstract idea of civilization. They were the living fact of it.
I love that phrasing.
His whole point is that these societies had their own internal logic and their own trajectory of development, which was violently interrupted and drained of its essence by the colonial machine.
You know, it's like a hostile corporate takeover. Like, the invading company strips all the assets, fires the staff, replaces them with machines, but then sends out a press release calling it a mentorship program.
That is a perfect structural analogy. It's the rebranding of absolute destruction as an act of developmental charity.
But, you know, the defenders of empire always have a counter-argument ready.
Always.
They argue that prior to colonization, many of these societies were isolated. And isn't isolation inherently bad for human development? They claim that colonialism, for all its undeniable brutality, ultimately forced different worlds into contact, which accelerates human progress.
Right. The contact argument.
Yeah. How does Césaire handle that defense?
He tackles it head on, and he actually agrees with the premise.
Right, he agrees.
Yeah. Césaire is a deeply cosmopolitan thinker. He writes that it is an unequivocally good thing to place different civilizations in contact with one another. He believes that exchange is the oxygen of culture, and that any civilization that withdraws into itself, that refuses outside influence, will eventually atrophy and die.
So he isn't advocating for isolationism at all.
Not at all. He even praises the historical role of Europe as a grand crossroads of ideas and philosophies.
Okay, so then where does he draw the line?
He pivots to the critical question: did colonization actually establish meaningful contact? Out of all the myriad ways human beings have devised to interact, trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, intermarriage, was colonization the best method?
And he concludes that it was the absolute worst.
He says that between colonization and true civilization, there is an infinite distance. He argues that out of all the punitive military expeditions, the brutal forced labor camps, the violated treaties, and the racist lies propagated to justify it all, not a single genuine human value could possibly emerge.
It's just inherently toxic.
Exactly. The contact was fundamentally poisoned from the start because it wasn't an exchange between equals. It was an imposition based on total domination.
Which brings us to the next massive pillar of his argument. If this process of colonization turns the colonized population into things, mere instruments of production, what does this daily systemic violence do to the colonizers themselves?
Right, the flip side of the coin.
This is where the discourse shifts from a critique of what Europe did to others to a terrifying autopsy of what Europe did to itself.
We are entering the territory of what Césaire calls the boomerang effect. And this is perhaps his most shocking and controversial thesis.
The boomerang effect. The imagery is visceral. You throw this weaponized violence out into the colonies, and the physics of the universe dictates that it will eventually whip around and strike you in the back of the head.
That is the exact mechanism he describes. Césaire posits that colonial activity does not just dehumanize the victims, it fundamentally irreparably brutalizes the perpetrator.
How so?
Think about the psychology involved. If you are a colonizer and you must continually treat other human beings like animals to extract their labor, and you do this day after day, year after year, you eventually have to kill your own empathy.
You have to numb yourself to it.
Exactly. To ease your conscience, you have to embrace a profound moral relativism. Over time, that constant performance of cruelty awakens buried atavistic instincts. The colonizer, in the act of treating men like beasts, transforms himself into a beast.
And he proves this not with abstract theory, but by bringing receipts. I mean, he doesn't rely on rumors or anti-colonial propaganda. He quotes directly from the published journals, memoirs, and letters of respected French military officers.
Men who were celebrated as heroes back in Paris.
Right. The evidence he curates is staggering because of how casual the violence is.
It really is.
I want to share one of the quotes he highlights because it's so disturbing. He quotes Colonel de Montignac, who was one of the celebrated conquerors of Algeria. Montignac writes in a letter, and I quote, "In order to banish the thoughts that sometimes besiege me, I have some heads cut off. Not the heads of artichokes, but the heads of men."
Just the casual equivalence between harvesting a vegetable and decapitating a human being. It reveals a mind that has completely lost its grip on the sanctity of human life.
And Césaire piles these examples up. He quotes Count d'Erson boasting about his troops bringing back an entire barrel full of human ears collected from prisoners.
It's just grotesque.
He describes General Gerard capturing a city in Africa that hadn't even offered resistance. The troops were reportedly so intoxicated by the smell of blood that they ignored orders and slaughtered everyone.
Yeah, and Césaire paints this haunting image of the aftermath, with the afternoon heat rising and the blood of 5,000 victims literally evaporating into the setting sun.
It's a nightmare. But he isn't recounting these atrocities merely to shock the reader.
No, not at all. He is building a systemic argument. Césaire asserts that every single time a head is casually cut off in Vietnam, or a girl is raped in Madagascar, or a man is tortured in the Congo, and the polite society in France or Belgium accepts it, or worse, justifies it, a universal regression takes place.
A sort of moral rot.
He calls it a psychological gangrene. He writes that a poison is instilled into the veins of Europe itself, and slowly but surely the entire continent proceeds towards savagery.
And this gangrene leads Césaire to make the most explosive historical claim in the entire text. I mean, writing just 10 years after the end of World War II, Césaire connects the specific exported violence of European colonialism directly to the rise of fascism in Europe.
Specifically to Hitler and the horrors of Nazism.
Right.
This is the argument that absolutely shook the European intelligentsia to its core. Césaire looks at the very distinguished, very humanistic European bourgeoisie, the people who consider themselves the victims of Nazi aggression. And he tells them, before you were its victims, you were its accomplices.
Wow. He argues that they tolerated the exact same ideological framework that birthed Nazism long before it was inflicted on them. They absolved it, they shut their eyes to it, they wrote academic papers legitimizing it. Why? Because until the 1930s, that specific brand of systemic racialized violence had been applied exclusively to non-European peoples.
If we break down the mechanism of Césaire's argument here, he is saying that Hitler's methodology, the racial hierarchies, the spatial expansion for living space, or Lebensraum, the concentration of populations, the mass executions, these were not demonic aberrations born out of nowhere in 1930s Germany.
Right. They had a precedent.
They had a long precedent. These methodologies were developed, tested, and perfected over centuries in the colonies. The blueprint for fascism was drawn in the overseas territories. Fascism was simply the application of colonialist procedures, previously reserved for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the black people of Africa, applied to the European continent.
That just reframes the entire narrative of the 20th century. In Césaire's view, what was Hitler's supreme, unforgivable crime in the eyes of the European establishment? It wasn't the crime against humanity itself.
If it were, they would have cared about the Congo or Algeria.
Exactly. Césaire argues that the true shock, the thing that caused such profound indignation among the Western establishment, was that Hitler applied these procedures to the white man.
He committed the crime against the white man. That is the boomerang returning. The violence cultivated in the colonial laboratory broke containment and struck the heart of the metropole.
I really want you, the listener, to let that idea marinate. Consider the sheer psychological weight of what Césaire is proposing. Can a society systematically build an economy on extreme violence, torture, and racial exploitation overseas for hundreds of years, sending generations of its young men out to enforce this brutality, and somehow expect that violence to never seep back into its own domestic borders?
It's impossible.
Right. Can you build an empire cemented with blood and truly believe that blood won't eventually stain the streets of your own capital?
It forces us to ask deep questions about the moral architecture of a nation. Césaire is fundamentally stating that you cannot compartmentalize barbarism.
You can't just keep it in a box.
No, You cannot designate a zone of savagery in the global south and expect to maintain a pristine, civilized, democratic garden at home. The psychological borders of a society are porous. The men who learn to cut off heads like artichokes eventually come home, and they bring that worldview with them.
But let me push back here on behalf of historians who might take issue with this direct parallel. Because Césaire draws a straight line from colonial outposts to the Gestapo, but doesn't that blur critical differences?
In what way?
Well, imperial expansion was primarily driven by economics and resource extraction, whereas the Holocaust was a systematic, ideologically driven genocide aimed at total extermination. Does Césaire acknowledge that difference?
He does. He doesn't conflate the specific logistical mechanisms, but he unites them philosophically under the broader umbrella of capitalist decay.
Okay, explain that.
Césaire views capitalism as a system that, when it reaches the end of its blind alley, when it faces extreme crises of resources or legitimacy, inevitably reveals its inner Hitler.
It's inner Hitler, wow.
Yeah, he writes that at the end of formal humanism and philosophic renunciation, there is Hitler. For Césaire, the sheer economic drive of imperialism required the invention of a racial ideology to justify the theft of land and labor.
Because otherwise, the cognitive dissonance is too much.
Exactly. And once you inject that racial ideology into the bloodstream of a society, if you take it to its logical, industrialized extreme, it results in fascism.
And to prove that this racist ideology was mainstream, he points to some of the most respected thinkers of the 19th century. He quotes the French philosopher Ernest Renan, who is considered a towering figure of Western humanism.
Yes, Renan is a perfect example. Decades before Hitler was born, Renan wrote a text arguing that nature had actively designed different races for different purposes.
Wait, nature designed them?
That was his argument. He wrote that nature made a race of workers, which he identified as the Chinese, noting their supposed wonderful manual dexterity and almost no sense of honor.
Oh my God.
Then he claimed nature made a race of tillers of the soil, identifying black people, who should be treated with kindness and justice so they remain docile.
That is just blatant white supremacy.
And it gets worse. Finally, he claimed nature made a race of masters and soldiers, which were, of course, the Europeans.
Of course. And Renan literally wrote that Europe should pour forth this all-consuming activity onto countries like China. He argued that every socialist rebel causing trouble in Europe was actually just a natural-born soldier missing his true calling, and that the solution was to send them overseas to conquer and rule.
And Césaire's point is that when Renan published those words, nobody in the polite salons of Paris protested.
They just accepted it as fact.
The established writers, the academics, the politicians, they all nodded along. It was considered sound scientific reasoning.
So Césaire argues that when Hitler later stands up and says, we aspire not to equality but to domination, he isn't inventing a new evil.
Right. He is merely echoing the established, deeply normalized bourgeois ideology of the 19th century. The intellectual groundwork for fascism was carefully laid by the respected defenders of colonialism.
Okay, so if the moral and historical arguments for colonialism completely collapse under the terrifying reality of this boomerang effect, the apologists for empire usually have a backup plan.
They always do.
When they can't defend the violence, they pivot to the material argument, they point to infrastructure. And this leads us to how Césaire dismantles the myth of progress and what we might call the ledger of imperialism.
Ah, yes, the classic look at the roads we built defense. It's the attempt to turn history into an accounting exercise.
Exactly. Apologists will point to the statistics. They pull out the ledgers and show the miles of roads paved, the canals dug, the railroads constructed, the hospitals built, the sanitation systems introduced.
And they try to argue that, yes, the process was ugly, but look at the bottom line. We modernized them.
Right. So how does Césaire respond to this statistical defense?
He attacks the ledger by entirely reevaluating the currency being used. When the colonizers point to the statistics of tonnage of cotton or cocoa exported, Césaire points to the millions of human beings torn from their gods, their ancestral lands, their daily habits, and their lives.
The human cost.
Exactly. When they point to the marvel of the railroad tracks, he zeroes in on specific projects, like the infamous Congo Ocean Line.
The Congo Ocean Line. This was a massive railway project connecting Brazzaville in the interior with Pointe Noire on the coast, right?
Yes. And Césaire writes, I am talking about thousands of men sacrificed to the Congo Ocean. And he wasn't exaggerating.
It was a death trap.
The construction of that infrastructure was done using forced labor, essentially a slave system.
Mm-hmm.
The mortality rates were horrific. with workers dying from starvation, disease, and sheer exhaustion.
So he forces the reader to acknowledge that these roads and ports were not built as philanthropic gifts to the indigenous population. They were built for one specific purpose: to expedite the extraction of wealth from the interior to the ships waiting at the coast.
Yeah.
It's like someone breaking into your house, stealing all your furniture, but leaving behind a microwave and expecting you to be grateful for the kitchen upgrade.
That captures the absurdity of the demand for gratitude perfectly. The infrastructure served the extractor, not the extracted. Furthermore, Césaire argues that the agricultural development they boast about was equally destructive.
Right, because they disrupted entirely self-sufficient farming ecosystems to create export economies.
Exactly. The colonizers would take regions that had harmonious natural subsistence farming, where communities grew diverse crops to feed themselves, and force them into monoculture.
Just growing one thing.
Right. They forced them to grow cash crops like peanuts, cotton, or cocoa, which were oriented solely toward the benefit of the metropolitan countries in Europe. This aggressive disruption destroyed local food security and permanently introduced malnutrition to vast regions of the globe.
So the colonized were literally forced to grow luxury crops for export while their own children starved.
It's incredibly bleak.
And Césaire points out a glaring historical irony that completely destroys the premise that colonization was a necessary prerequisite for modernization. He simply points to Japan.
Japan is the ultimate counterfactual in his argument.
How so?
It proves that modernization, industrialization, and technical outfitting are in no way inextricably tied to European political occupation. During the Meiji Restoration, Japan rapidly modernized, built incredible infrastructure, and became an industrial powerhouse entirely on its own terms without ever being formally colonized by a European power.
So the Europeanization or modernization of non-European continents could absolutely have been accomplished without the heel of Europe crushing them.
Yes, and he flips the script on who is actually holding back human progress. He notes that in the 1950s, as he is writing, it is the colonized people who were desperately demanding more schools, better ports, and functional roads, while it is the European colonial administrators who are constantly acting stingy, refusing funding, and actively holding back development to maintain a grip on power.
It makes you wonder why the infrastructure defense is so incredibly effective, you know? Why do so many people buy into the idea that a new hospital or a railway line somehow balances out systemic oppression?
Because that argument speaks the native language of modern capitalism. It reduces profound moral questions to a tidy spreadsheet. If you can show a quantifiable increase in GDP or point to a tangible physical structure like a dam, it feels objective. It wears the disguise of progress.
It looks clean on paper.
Exactly. And Césaire is incredibly sharp on this psychological point. He says the brain of the petty bourgeois functions like a filter. It is designed to only let through information that can nourish their clear conscience.
They only see what they want to see.
They simply do not want to hear about the tortured Madagascans or the violently destroyed cultures. They only want to look at the export numbers because the numbers make them feel civilized.
Which provides the perfect bridge into understanding the role of the intellectual class. Because if the general public remained blind to this reality for so long, insulated by these statistics and ledgers, Césaire argues it wasn't just the fault of the politicians or the generals?
No, the intellectual class played a massive role.
Right. The European public was shielded by a massive, sophisticated smokescreen generated by the universities and the church.
This is where Césaire turns his sights on his own peers. As an academic and a poet, he knows exactly how language is used to launder violence. He heavily critiques the academics of his day, the geographers, the theologians, the sociologists, the psychologists.
And he calls them the watchdogs of colonialism.
I love that phrase.
Me too.
Yeah.
They are the watchdogs because their entire job is to provide the theoretical, intellectual justification for the theft, making it sound like natural law. Let's look at some of the specific intellectuals he takes aim at. Because he goes after a very prominent geographer named M. Guru. What exactly was Guru's crime in Césaire's eyes?
Guru authored a book that essentially argued for a concept we might call tropicality. He claimed that, due to the unforgiving nature of tropical climates, great civilizations could organically exist only in temperate zones.
So places like Europe.
Exactly. According to Guru, in any tropical country, the germ of true civilization could only be introduced from the outside, meaning, of course, from Europe. He framed it as a geographical curse.
So he uses geography to make European dominance seem like a biological necessity.
Exactly. Césaire dissects this seemingly objective scientific observation to reveal its deep bias. He notes that when Guru acknowledges that colonialism introduced horrific forced labor and devastated the biological environment, Guru frames it not as a crime, but as a tragic dilemma.
A dilemma, like they had no choice.
Right. Guru writes that the tropics face a choice, either economic stagnation or temporary development achieved through the regression of the natives.
And Césaire just openly mocks this framing. He basically says Guru is too terrified of losing his cushy university career to tell the truth.
Yeah, Guru refuses to state the obvious, which is that this so-called dilemma isn't a rule of nature or geography. It only exists because of the specific, exploitative nature of colonialist capitalism.
Then Césaire shifts his focus from the physical world to the spiritual world. He takes aim at the theologians, and he reserves a special venom for a Belgian missionary named Reverend Tempels.
Yes, Reverend Tempels and his famous book on Bantu philosophy. This is a truly wild piece of intellectual gymnastics.
It really is. Explain what Tempels was arguing.
Tempels wrote a highly influential study arguing that the Bantu people of the Congo possessed a highly complex ontological philosophy. Ontology being the philosophical study of being, existence, and reality.
Okay, so far so good.
Tempels claimed the Bantu worldview was based entirely on a hierarchy of life forces. Now, on the surface, this sounds quite respectful, right? A European priest acknowledging the deep philosophical framework of an African people.
It sounds progressive for the time.
But then, Tempels reveals his conclusion. He deduces that because the Bantu are so focused on these abstract life forces, what they truly desire most is not an improvement in their miserable material situation.
Wait, what?
They don't care about decent wages or sufficient food or political freedom. What they crave is simply the spiritual recognition of their dignity by the white man.
How incredibly convenient for the Belgian mining companies.
Exactly. Césaire just eviscerates this logic. He sarcastically applauds Tempels, saying it's a brilliant setup where everybody wins. The massive extraction companies, the colonists, the brutal government, they all get to keep the money and the power.
Right.
All you have to do is tip your hat to the Bantu soul, give a little wink to their life force, and you are morally cleared to steal all their material wealth.
And it gets worse, right? Didn't Tempels also argue that the Bantu had somehow integrated the white colonialists into their own spiritual hierarchy?
He did. Tempels argued that in the Bantu hierarchy of life forces, the white man was positioned at a very high level of spiritual authority. Therefore, if a Bantu person rebelled against the oppressive Belgian government, they weren't just breaking a colonial law. They were fundamentally committing a sacrilege against their own internal belief system.
That is just. It is the ultimate theological hijacking. It turns the victim's own spirituality into a warden.
It really does.
But I think the most devastating critique of all is reserved for a psychologist named M. Mennoni, who invented a concept called the dependency complex.
This one is truly mind-bending, and it shows how easily the language of modern psychology can be weaponized. Mennoni argued that colonized people are psychologically hardwired for dependence.
Like they want it.
Yes, he claims they don't actually want freedom or autonomy. Deep down in their psyche, they crave dependence and they demand a master.
To understand how insidious this is, we have to look at how Mennoni applied it to real-world events.
Right. Césaire points to the Malagasy uprising of 1947 in Madagascar. This was a massive rebellion against French colonial rule, and the French military crushed it with unimaginable brutality, killing tens of thousands of Malagasy people.
A total bloodbath.
How does Mennoni, the psychologist, explain this horrific bloodshed? He doesn't blame the crushing weight of French occupation or the violence of the colonial state. He blames the Malagasy people themselves, diagnosing them with a collective neurosis.
Wait, he uses psychology to blame the victims for revolting. How does he justify that?
Mennoni uses a crude mix of psychoanalysis decorated with a bit of existentialist jargon. He claims that the Malagasy people viewed the white colonialists as gods and expected them to solve all their problems.
Oh, come on!
And when the colonialists inevitably failed to act like perfect providing gods, the Malagasy experienced a psychological break, a neurotic emotional disturbance, which manifested as a violent rebellion.
So the decades of forced labor, torture, and theft were irrelevant.
According to Mennoni, yes. He essentially argued that the tortures the colonized suffered were largely imaginary tortures born of their own psychological inadequacy.
Wow.
And if the French military had to shed blood to put down the rebellion, it was merely an unfortunate but necessary response to the emotional disturbances of the natives.
It is the perfect intellectual alibi. It completely absolves the bloodthirsty colonial system by turning the victims into psychiatric patients.
It is sickening.
Césaire points out that this is the persistent, defining goal of bourgeois intellectuals, to take the most urgent, bleeding human problems and reduce them to comfortable, hollow, abstract notions, concepts like the dependency complex, or Bantu ontology, or tropicality.
They act as a magic trick.
Right. They make the bullwhips, the crushing taxes, and the murdered innocents disappear into a cloud of pale academic rationalizations.
And this raises an incredibly urgent question for us today. I mean, when we consume modern news or read economic reports, how often do we see sophisticated academic or scientific language used to mask real-world exploitation?
That's a great point.
When we hear sanitized terms like structural adjustment programs or market corrections or collateral damage or flexible labor markets, are we simply listening to the modern watchdogs of a new kind of economic empire? Are we being fed new theories that sanitize the reality of human suffering?
It's a very sharp, unsettling parallel. Césaire is warning us never to be fooled by the prestige of the source. It doesn't matter if the person speaking is a revered priest, an Ivy League geographer, or a Nobel-winning economist. If their theory functions to justify the oppression of human beings, it is not science. It is a tool of violence.
Absolutely.
But I want to explore nuance here because Césaire doesn't just attack the overt racists. He also goes fiercely after intellectuals who seem, on the surface, to be promoting a more progressive, tolerant worldview.
Right? The well-meaning liberals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He spent a significant amount of time dismantling the arguments of Roger Caillois. Now, Caillois was an intellectual who argued that different cultures are unequal, in fact, meaning the West has achieved more technologically and scientifically, but he insisted that all cultures should be equal in law.
So he's saying, we're better, but we should be nice.
Pretty much. Caillois says, essentially, yes, the West invented science and advanced ethics, but because of our superior ethics, we shouldn't exterminate anyone. We should be magnanimous and tolerant.
Right.
Why does Césaire find this specific brand of paternalism just as dangerous, if not more so, than outright hatred?
Because paternalism is the insidious velvet glove that hides the iron fist of racism. Caillois is arguing for tolerance, but that tolerance is based entirely on the supposed nobility and superiority of the colonizer, not on the intrinsic inherent worth of the colonized.
He is effectively saying we are superior beings, and out of the goodness of our advanced hearts, we will benevolently allow you backwards people to exist.
It's a conditional equality.
Exactly, and Césaire sees right through the danger of conditional equality. If equality is granted merely as an act of charity by a self-proclaimed superior race, it is not true equality. It means the colonizer retains the ultimate authority.
They retain the power to define value, to define who is backward and who is advanced, and crucially, they retain the power to revoke that tolerance whenever it suits them.
And Césaire notes that if Caillois believes these supposed differences in civilizational level give the West additional tasks and increased responsibilities toward the rest of the world, what is that but a fresh justification for ruling the globe?
It's just the old, racist white man's burden, dressed up in sleek, new philosophical robes.
Okay, so up to this point in the discourse, Césaire has essentially spent his time burning down the intellectual house of Europe. He has systematically dismantled the moral argument of the civilizing mission, he's crushed the material argument of infrastructure, and he has exposed the intellectual watchdogs for what they are.
He leaves absolutely nothing standing.
But that destructive process begs a massive question. What comes next? Once you have entirely deconstructed an identity that was imposed on you by a colonizer, how do you go about building a new one from the ashes?
And to understand Césaire's solution to that problem, we have to transition from his political critique to his creative genesis. This is where we bring in the insights from his 1967 interview with René Dupestre.
Moving from destruction to creation.
Exactly. In that interview, Dupestre asks Césaire about the origins of his poetry, specifically his masterpiece, Return to My Native Land. And Césaire uses that prompt to explain the birth of a concept he famously coined negritude.
Negritude. To truly grasp the power of that, you first have to understand the stifling psychological environment it was fighting against, right?
Yeah. Césaire describes the atmosphere in the Antilles, and particularly Martinique, during his youth as one of profound alienation. The French assimilationist education system was designed to make black people ashamed of their blackness. They suffered from a psychological condition he refers to as bovarism.
Bovarism. I want to make sure we define that clearly for the listener. It stems from the character Madame Bovary, right?
Yes, exactly.
It implies a state of chronic alienation where you romanticize a false version of yourself, trying desperately to be something you fundamentally are not.
That's precisely it. In the context of Martinique, it meant a population of black people who were striving with all their might to be white Frenchmen. Césaire tells this tragic, highly revealing anecdote about a poor Martinican pharmacist.
Oh, with the poetry contest.
Yes, this man spent all his free time writing classical French sonnets and submitting them to prestigious literary contests back in mainland France, like the Floral Games of Toulouse. And this pharmacist was incredibly proud when he finally won a prize.
But the tragic irony, as Césaire points out, is that the man was proud specifically because the judges in France had absolutely no idea the poems were written by a man of color.
Because his poetry was so perfectly colorless, it was so thoroughly stripped of his own reality, his own geography, and his own identity, that it passed seamlessly as the work of a white European.
Wow. For Césaire, that wasn't a triumph of assimilation. It was a crushing condemnation. It was the ultimate proof of spiritual death.
He notes that Antillians of his generation were constantly searching for euphemisms to describe themselves. They would use terms like man of color or dark complexioned, anything they could think of to avoid the word negra, which had been loaded with centuries of deep shame and degradation.
So Césaire and his intellectual peers decided to perform a radical act of linguistic reclamation. They took that exact word, the word used to humiliate them, and they turned it into a weapon of defiance, a violent, proud affirmation of their identity. Thus, the birth of Negritude.
But here's where we encounter a fascinating, almost contradictory aspect of Césaire's intellectual journey. To break free of European thought, he actually utilized a European avant-garde artistic movement, surrealism.
It seems like a paradox, but it makes perfect sense when you look at the mechanics of language. Césaire was suffocating under the weight of traditional French literature. The French language is famously built on Cartesian logic, the whole I think, therefore I am philosophy of René Descartes.
It is hyper-rational, structurally rigid, and deeply ordered.
Right. And Césaire realized he could never express the chaotic, buried pain and the vibrant reality of the Black experience using the stiff, polite, logical grammar of the people who colonized him. He needed something that could blow that language apart.
And surrealism was the dynamite.
Exactly. Surrealism was an artistic movement focused on liberating the unconscious mind, relying on dream logic, automatic writing, and the juxtaposition of bizarre imagery to bypass rational thought.
Césaire says he was ready to accept surrealism because he was already desperately searching for a way to explode the traditional French language.
It's the classic strategy of taking the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, but he's using those tools to build something entirely unrecognizable to the master.
He realized that if he applied this surrealist approach, if he abandoned the superficial logical French customs he had been taught and plunged into the chaotic depths of his own unconscious mind, he wouldn't just find abstract dreams.
What would he find?
He would find his ancestral layers. He would find the repressed trauma and the enduring spirit of Africa. Surrealism became his method for a profound disalienation, a way to reach past the colonized mind and touch his authentic, buried Black identity.
And this massive cultural awakening didn't happen in isolation. In the interview, he details a very specific, incredibly important geographic and temporal meeting point.
Paris, during the years between the two world wars.
Yes. You had a vibrant, almost electric gathering of Black students, writers, and intellectuals converging from all over the globe. From Martinique, Guyana, the United States, and of course from Africa. He speaks with immense reverence about meeting Léopold Sédar Senghor.
Senghor, who would go on to become a towering intellectual figure and the first president of an independent Senegal.
Senghor was a revelation for Césaire. For Césaire, Senghor didn't just represent African intellect, he embodied the continent itself. Senghor revealed the deep singularity and the rich heritage of Africa to a Martinican who had been entirely cut off from it by history.
And together with other key figures, like the Nardal sisters, who hosted influential salons, they formed a tight-knit intellectual group. They launched a small but incredibly impactful periodical called L'Étudiant Noir, the Black Student.
This publication was a watershed moment. It was the moment of realizing a global, interconnected solidarity among Black people.
They recognized that regardless of whether they were living under Jim Crow in the U.S., colonial rule in Africa, or the assimilationist policies of the Caribbean, they shared a fundamental Negro situation.
But within that global perspective, there is one specific nation that Césaire holds above all others as the ultimate beacon of negritude, and that is Haiti.
He had a profound, almost mythic admiration for Haiti, famously calling it the place where negritude stood on its feet for the first time.
And the historical context there is vital. While Martinique in the 1930s was still an alienated land firmly under French control, Haiti represented the heroic, unbroken spirit of the African Antilles.
Haiti was the site of the first and only successful slave rebellion in modern history that culminated in the creation of a free, independent republic.
Led by brilliant, uncompromising figures like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, for Césaire, the history of the Haitian Revolution wasn't just in the past, it was negritude in action.
It was concrete, undeniable proof that black people could stand up, militarily overthrow their oppressors, reject the colonial framework entirely, and shape their own destiny on the world stage.
This brings up a critical question regarding Césaire's methods. He is using surrealist poetry, cultural reclamation, and the celebration of history to fight this battle. But how does this profound cultural awakening intersect with his hardline Marxist politics?
That's the big question.
Right, because writing a brilliant, explosive poem is one thing, but can poetry actually dismantle global capitalism and defeat colonial armies?
That question leads us directly into the final evolution of his thought, where he merges the cultural with the economic. Césaire fundamentally believed that you could not separate the two.
Well, we both.
Exactly. A political revolution without a cultural awakening would inevitably fail because the minds of the people would remain colonized.
This becomes very clear in the interview when he explains his eventual, highly publicized break with the mainstream French Communist Party. Originally, like many anti-colonial intellectuals of his era, Césaire and his peers aligned with the political left, believing quite logically that liberation was certainly never going to come from the conservative right.
But he soon realized that the orthodox French communists had a massive blind spot regarding race.
A huge blind spot. The orthodox Marxist view at the time was deeply reductive regarding identity. The communists believed that the black question was entirely a subset of the broader social and economic class struggle.
Their argument was, if we just focus on changing the material conditions, if the working class proletariat seizes the means of production and overthrows the bourgeoisie, racism will simply evaporate as a byproduct.
And Césaire fiercely rejected that. He knew from lived experience that racism wasn't just a byproduct of capitalism, it was its own distinct, brutalizing force. He explained to the communist leadership that black people are subjected to a unique double alienation.
Double alienation is a vital concept to understand his worldview. On the first level, yes, black workers are proletarianized, they are exploited for their labor, and their surplus value is stolen, exactly like a white factory worker in Paris or Manchester.
Right.
But on a second, much deeper and more insidious level, they are alienated because they belong to the only racial group in modern history that was systematically, legally, and philosophically denied the very notion of humanity.
A white French factory worker might be poor and exploited, but the state still recognizes him as a human being. The colonial state looked at the black worker and saw an animal, a thing.
Precisely. Therefore, Césaire argued that the struggle of colonized people couldn't merely be about securing fair wages or better working conditions. It was an existential fight to reclaim their basic ontological status as human beings.
He famously stated that you cannot just fix the economy without fixing the soul. He respected Marxist economic analysis, but he said, we need to complete Marx.
Political and economic emancipation would be meaningless without a profound psychological disalienation of the mind.
And as we return to the discourse to examine his final warnings for the future, we see how this intricate understanding of race and economics shapes his view of the shifting global power dynamics. Having diagnosed the terminal sickness of the old European empires, Césaire looks across the Atlantic Ocean and spots a new, even more terrifying threat rising to take their place.
He calls this new threat the modern barbarian.
He is, of course, referring to the United States.
It's important to remember he is writing this in 1955. The old European empires are visibly crumbling, and Césaire sees American imperialism eagerly stepping into the global power vacuum.
And he issues a stark warning to the world, stating that American domination is the only domination from which one never recovers.
It's a chilling prediction.
Yeah.
Why did he view American hegemony as uniquely dangerous, perhaps even worse than the brutal European colonialism he had just spent 50 pages dissecting?
Because of the scale, the sheer mechanization, and the insidious, invisible nature of it. He writes about the massive influx of American capital investments, the bulldozers arriving, the cookie-cutter factories springing up in the bush.
European colonialism was often overtly physically brutal, a soldier with a rifle demanding tribute. But Césaire foresaw American imperialism operating differently.
Right. He saw a massive, mechanized corporate machine that doesn't necessarily need to conquer your land militarily because it can colonize your economy and your mind through overwhelming financial force.
He refers to it as the gigantic rape of everything intimate. It is a totalizing force that homogenizes culture, grinds up local traditions, and turns independent people into compliant consumers and lackeys for multinational corporations.
He explicitly warns his readers not to be fooled by the new optimistic language coming out of Washington. He quotes American leaders of the era men like Ambassador Page and President Truman, who were publicly boasting about how the leadership of the free world had naturally fallen into American hands, and who used the rhetoric of providing aid to the disinherited countries.
Césaire says, look closely at that aid. He warns that American high finance has simply calculated that the time has come to raid every colony in the world for themselves, replacing the old European flags with corporate logos.
So having mapped out this landscape of total decay where Europe is dying of its own violent gangrene and America is rising as a mechanized modern barbarian, what is Césaire's ultimate solution? What is the path forward for humanity?
He does not offer a gentle compromise. He issues a radical, uncompromising call. He believes the salvation of Europe, and indeed the entire world, cannot be achieved through minor policy reforms or a change in administrative methods.
The entire system is structurally rotten. Therefore, the only solution is the revolution. He calls for the global proletariat to rise up and create a truly classless society.
He argues that the narrow, self-serving tyranny of a completely dehumanized bourgeoisie must be overthrown and replaced by the only class of people who still possess a universal historical mission.
And why the proletariat? Because, Césaire argues, they are the only class that has suffered in their very flesh from all the accumulated wrongs of history.
It's a demand for a total system reboot.
Yeah.
He's telling his readers that the machine of global empire is fundamentally irreparably broken. It cannot be reformed from within.
It cannot be improved with a fresh coat of progressive paint, or a new mentorship program, or a slightly fairer trade agreement.
No. The machine must be dismantled entirely, down to its bolts, and a new world must be built by the very people who have paid the bloody cost of its operation for centuries.
It is the ultimate synthesis of his life's work. He links the fierce cultural reclamation of negritude with the uncompromising economic liberation of Marxism, insisting to the end that one cannot possibly succeed without the other.
Wow.
Let's take a deep breath and look back at the incredible intellectual terrain we have traversed today. We began by exploring how Césaire exposes the brutal thing-ification at the heart of colonialism, tearing away the pious lie of the civilizing mission.
We examined the terrifying mechanics of the boomerang effect, the reality that exporting immense violence inevitably poisons the soul of the colonizer, paving the psychological road for fascism at home.
We watched him dismantle the ledger of imperialism, proving that no amount of railroads or export statistics can balance out the destruction of viable cultures and millions of stolen lives.
And we explored how intellectual watchdogs, using the respectable language of geography, psychology, and theology, provided the necessary smokescreen for that exploitation.
Then we explored his creative response, the triumphant reclamation of Black identity through Negritude, his brilliant use of surrealism to break the Cartesian chains of the French language, and his deep understanding of double alienation.
Finally, we unpacked his stark, prophetic warning about the rise of the mechanized, modern American barbarian.
The Discourse on Colonialism was published in 1955, but the challenge it presents is meant for you, the listener, today.
Yes. As you navigate the modern world, as you consume the news, read history, or listen to politicians justify foreign interventions or global economic policies, Césaire demands that you ask the hard questions.
Who is actually paying the true human cost of what is labeled progress? And who are the modern watchdogs, the think tank analysts, the economists, the pundits, using sanitized academic language to explain away human suffering?
His work is an enduring masterclass in critical thinking. It is a demand to look beneath the noble justifications and see the raw, unvarnished mechanics of power.
It demands that we never close our eyes to the crises our own civilization creates.
Absolutely.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative image to mull over on your own. It is an image drawn from Césaire's blistering critique of Western museums, a topic we touched on briefly when discussing the paternalism of Roger Caillois.
Oh, this is a powerful point.
It really is. Césaire wrote extensively about how Western capitals proudly display the artifacts of the cultures they actively destroyed. You know, the scene, the sacred masks, the intricate bronzes, the ancient sculptures, all perfectly lit and displayed behind thick glass.
Right. And he notes that the defenders of Western civilization point to these museums as proof of their broad-mindedness and their appreciation for global art.
But Césaire argues that Europe would have done infinitely better to simply tolerate those civilizations side by side in the real world, leaving them alive, dynamic, and breathing, rather than murdering them and presenting their dead and scattered parts for polite weekend admiration.
He delivers this devastating, unforgettable line. In the scales of knowledge, all the museums in the world will never weigh so much as one spark of human sympathy.
So I want you to consider this the next time you walk through the echoing halls of a grand museum of natural history or anthropology in London, Paris, or New York. As you gaze at those beautifully curated exhibits, ask yourself, are you truly looking at a celebration of global human achievement? Or, as Césaire suggests, are you quietly walking through a beautifully curated crime scene?
A display of dead and scattered parts, legitimized and protected by the very civilization that extinguished their living breath.
Think about that.